my clock, it's 1 o'clock. Hi everybody and welcome to our fourth in the webinar series of No Time to Waste. My name's Sharon Rundle-Teely, I'm from Griffith University, and today we are joined by three fabulous speakers from Australia and New Zealand, but I'll let Ricky introduce them to you. I just wanted to let you know that we are filming today's session, so please keep yourself muted at all times just to keep the filming quality to the best. It also stops interference for our speakers. At any point during today's conversation, you are welcome to put comments into the chat channel. You can pose questions for the speakers there, and then I'll use the questions that come through and put them out to the speakers at the end of their presentations. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ricky Herzberg. Thanks, Ricky.
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here today. Welcome to the second series of our No Time to Waste webinar, Plastic Oceans Australasia and Social Marketing at Griffith University. Thank you for all joining us here today. To give some context about the series and why it is relevant to today's discussion, earlier in the year when COVID-19 hit our world, we were shocked at the amount of PPE entering our waterways and felt compelled as an organisation to start a conversation about this issue by looking at people's habits in relation to plastic waste and the global pandemic. Soon after, we were asked to continue the journey where we looked at the science behind the plastic, followed by the third session, which was seeking solution-based answers from a government policy perspective. At the last session, the panel asked about the reality of the Australasia region agreeing on a one plastic policy. I'm pleased to share with you a comment from one of these speakers, being Mr. David O'Loughlin from ALGA, who said, "It's all about national leadership," stating that it is paramount the federal government, the Environment Minister, Susan Ley, continues to coordinate and implement the implementation of the national waste policy and the export bans. This statement is particularly relevant for the continuing discussion today, with the focus being on product stewardship and packaging. On that note, I'd like to get started with today's panel. I'll introduce each guest as they present, beginning with Senator Peter Whish-Wilson. Peter Whish-Wilson is a Senator for Tasmania and the Australian Greens spokesperson for waste and recycling. Peter has chaired Senate inquiries such as Toxic Tide, Never Waste a Crisis, and continues to campaign against plastic pollution. He currently has a private member's bill in the Senate to mandate recycling targets and ban some single-use plastics. On a lighter note, Peter has a deep love for the ocean and as such takes time out to go for a surf when he can and is often known by his social media followers as Senator Surfer. We, as in Plastic Oceans Australasia, connected with Peter when we launched our foundation in 2017 at Parliament House in Canberra. All politics aside, on this auspicious occasion, Peter, along with Tony Burke and Trent Zimmerman, co-hosted the launch of our international award-winning film, A Plastic Ocean. And the rest is history. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Senator Peter Whish-Wilson.
Is that working now, Ricky?
Yep, I can hear you.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for everything you do, Ricky. I'm looking a little bit more rugged in the COVID ISO way than I am in the photo that you've distributed for this event, but I appreciate you inviting me to be on the panel today because it's actually a really important time to be having this discussion. Now, I've been campaigning on plastic pollution for nearly 15 years. Both in Parliament and outside of Parliament. And I can tell you there's never been as much momentum as right now in the halls of power in Canberra to do something about our waste crisis that we've had in this country. It's no secret that the Prime Minister told the Australian public last year that his daughter had been putting pressure on him to act on plastic pollution in the ocean.
Yeah.
And of course, he spoke to the United Nations about the need for all countries to take a coordinated effort on this most pervasive of pollution issues on the planet. So certainly he's he's been out there campaigning on this issue, and I've got to say I never thought I would see that from, well, any leading politician in the country, let alone from a Prime Minister. It may surprise people to know that I was, and we did an extensive Hansard search in 2012 when I started in the Senate, but I was the first senator to talk about plastic pollution in the ocean. I was on the board of Surfrider Foundation prior to that for many years, and that as a global group had been campaigning on a Rise Above Plastics campaign since 2006. So it's been a long road. I have used the Senate resources to look into the issue of marine plastic pollution. In fact, the world's first Senate parliamentary inquiry into this issue. It went for nearly 18 months, took evidence from all around the country, and across the political spectrum, made a number of recommendations that got broad support. Following that, of course, we had the now famous China sword policy, where we weren't able to export our tainted, let's call it our tainted waste exports to other countries, and the rug was pulled out under the feet of the export industry, and we had to come up with better solutions. So then I looked into that issue with the Senate. I chaired both these committees, and of course we also once again went around the country taking evidence from a number of stakeholders, especially across local governments, across the recycling industry, from environment groups, from community groups, and we once again came up with a series of recommendations on how to go around fixing the waste crisis. So the Senate's worked across not just political boundaries, but across industry boundaries. We've done a lot of comprehensive work, and the blueprint, if I could call it that, for solving the waste crisis was then put into a private member's bill, which I put into the Senate nearly 18 months ago. So it's good to see the government taking some action. And while we've got the Prime Minister's attention, while we've got the department's attention, while the public are very focused on this issue, it's very encouraging for me to see the change in public consciousness around recognition of plastic pollution in our oceans as being a significant issue. I think Chase's War on Waste, the great work that people such as yourselves, Ricky, and the environment movement have been doing on this issue, David Attenborough's Blue Planet, a whole range of things have culminated in a change in public consciousness on this issue. So while it's great that we've got legislation before the Senate next week, we're expecting it to be before the House and the Senate by Thursday next week to be debated. I can say if we don't get it right, it will also be a huge missed opportunity. Politics being what it is, and I hate to be cynical, but the box will be ticked and we'll have moved on from solving the waste crisis probably from next Thursday, with a likely election next year and a number of other issues that'll take the government's attention. So we have a one-off opportunity, in my opinion, that we haven't seen in 20 years to get this right. And we don't want it to be half-baked. The legislation that's before us at the moment does two things. It basically bans the exports of certain waste streams to overseas countries, which puts pressure on Australian industry to better recycle and also develop a circular economy. And it also rewrites the product stewardship scheme from over 15 years ago. Now, the problem is, if you go back to the Prime Minister's statements around his daughter and the concern to tackle plastic pollution in oceans, if you go back to the discussion to the UN, the bill as it stands at the moment excludes packaging. So the major part of the bill that deals with product stewardship schemes excludes packaging. Packaging in this country under the Packaging Covenant falls under NEPM, which is a totally separate legislative and regulatory structure to what the Senate will be debating. So in my opinion, as a conservationist, and Ricky, my background also is I've run businesses, I've worked in finance, I've been an economics lecturer. I also understand how that part of this fits into the equation. But we have a situation where the key problem with plastics in our ocean, which is tied to our consumption and production, especially of single-use plastics, is not at all tackled in this bill. Now, the department might argue that a ban on plastic wastes is helping that problem, but if we don't recycle it properly in this country, and we don't repurpose and we don't redesign, and we don't change our consumption and production habits of certain kinds of packaging that we know is very dangerous in our marine environment, then the bill's going to have no impact on that at all, which I would say defeats the purpose, and certainly the stated purpose of the Prime Minister to go down the road that we're arriving at next week in the Australian Senate. So I would like to see two things done to the bill, and I'm supported by the local governments around the country, by most of the recycling industry, which employs 60,000 people in this country, certainly by the environment movement and NGOs and community groups. We would like to see mandatory product stewardship schemes for packaging, where the current voluntary targets that industry have set are simply taken and put into legislation. So they need to be met. There'll be no excuses if they're not met, and there'll be penalties if they're not met. So just simply take what's already existing and put it into legislation. The second thing is we'd like to do what the European Parliament has done and ban problematic single-use plastics. Now, interestingly, on this issue, everybody agrees. The packaging industry, at least publicly, agree. The big retailers like Woolworths and Coles agree. The Food and Grocery Council agree that there are problematic single-use plastics that just can't be recycled, but they also usually make up the top 10 items we find in beaches and in the oceans. So we would like to do what the European Parliament has done and ban, as a start, those 10 items, which are prescribed in my private member's bill. Now, there'll be a number of other things we'd like to see amended, and I can say I hope the government right now is working with stakeholders. It's been a very collaborative process to date, which is unusual in today's political environment. Everyone's been working well together on this issue, and I'm hopeful that when the bill hits the Senate next week, we will have a reasonable framework and architecture in place to give me confidence, and not just me, but the public, who really are demanding action on this issue, the recycling industry, and a whole range of other important stakeholders, that we are going down the right path, that this won't be a missed opportunity, that we'll be able to lock in some action. Now, it may not be enough for some people, and I respect that. And sometimes my harshest critics are people from the green movement. They would like to see a lot more done than we've got on the table at the moment, but we've at least got to start there and ban certain single-use plastics and really design a circular economy. And there'll be a number of other amendments that'll be put up to the Senate next week to try and facilitate that. So I'm in a good mood about this at the moment. We'll see how we go next week when the legislation is tabled. But for me, I'll finish by saying it's been a 15-year road for taking action. It's one of the key reasons I went into Parliament, was to campaign on this issue. It is without a doubt one of the biggest pollution issues on the planet. I won't go through the stats with you, but we are finding microplastic in plankton in the Antarctic at the moment. It is all through our ecosystem. We absolutely have to do something, and it needs to be real action, and it certainly is what the public is calling for. I don't know if I have any extra time, Ricky, but I'm happy to finish there if it assists.
I fear we may have lost Ricky. She's gone very, very still on my feed, Peter, from what I can actually see. It was great to learn more about your work and what you're actually seeking to achieve. If you had your way and you could move beyond the single-use plastic 10 items that you're seeking to ban, what else would you actually be championing personally? Morgan, can we just unmute Peter?
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yeah,
Yes,
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Look, this is a very complex problem, and everybody agrees there's no silver bullet. I am coming at this issue undoubtedly from the perspective of a conservationist. I would like to see the issue of plastics in the ocean tackled. Australia has a contribution to make. Most people don't realise, but having done numerous beach cleanups myself over the years, and having seen the research that's been done, most of the plastic we find on Australian beaches is from local sources. While it is a massive global issue, we all have a role to play. So I would like to see a better balance achieved through a whole range of different incentives that government has a role to play in. Take a product stewardship scheme. It puts the onus on action by the consumer, by the producers of the plastic items. Let's say it's plastic bottles. It has a role for government to play and local government to play. And in that sense, it actually balances the responsibility of this problem amongst all the key stakeholders. So I would like to see a whole range of incentives put in place, which is actually in my bill, and we'll be talking about amendments next week, that better take the responsibility away just from consumers, which I believe it's been very much a consumer-led drive over the years to recycle and to put rubbish in bins and do these kind of things, to a true circular economy where waste doesn't exist. The concept of waste doesn't exist because everything has value. Everything is designed for its end-of-life use, and no resources are wasted. And I am concerned that we will, with an export ban and Australia solving its own recycling issues, that we may still flow to the lowest common denominator and go down the road of, for example, burning plastic for energy. I don't think that's recycling. I think that's surrender. But that is still on the table, and it is a risk that we may still choose to move away from a circular economy and go down other roads that really don't solve the problem in the first place, and that is convincing people they don't need as much plastic as they use, and making sure that plastic that is sold is designed for its end-of-life use.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And there's a couple of questions coming through on the chat channel with a few answers there in terms of where can we find more information to read up on the bill. So if you can either unmute Morgan so Peter can just answer verbally, but if you're okay, we can help just make sure that links being supplied are giving information that is available that people can access.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It does say confidential there, so I can't show you the details, but the Senate is just releasing its report into the government's bill today. It will be up on the committee website. So what I'll do is I'll get you the link that you can share with people. There'll be it's a draft report now. There'll be a final report this afternoon. There'll be comments about the bill, a summary of stakeholder feedback across the board from local government, from the packaging industry, from recyclers, environment groups, so on. And then there'll be additional comments that the Labor Party and the Greens and any other crossbenchers may wish to make about the bill. So it'll be a really compact summary of the large piece of legislation. I think it's about only about 30 pages long, really. So it's a good read, and it summarises the key issues that need to be addressed, as well as what the bill's trying to achieve. So that's probably the best place to start.
That's fabulous. Thanks, Peter. And I just want to check, have we got Ricky back?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. Ricky. I'll bow out again.
Yeah. I wasn't sure whether it was Peter that froze or I froze, so I think it must have been me. So sorry, I missed that last bit, Peter. So thank you so much. Do we have time for one more question for Peter, or we wait till the end?
We'll wait till the end.
Yep. Okay, good. Thanks, Peter. We'll come back to you. So as with all of our webinars, we like to ensure that we have an international representation, and today is no exception. It's my great pleasure to introduce from across the Tasman, and Hannah's told me it's lovely and shiny and warm over there, which is terrific. Hannah Bloomhart, who will provide insights about the product stewardship and packaging from a New Zealand perspective. Hannah is a really interesting lady. She not only talks the talk, she also walks the walk, having lived without rubbish and without a rubbish bin, I should say, for more than 5 years. To keep her inspired, she admits she's a bit of a coffee addict, and today it just so happens it's International Coffee Day. So we hope you're enjoying your good cup of brew in New Zealand, Hannah. Hannah is the coordinator of the New Zealand Product Stewardship Council. She's the co-founder of the Rubbish Trip and the policy spokesperson for Takeaway Throwaways. Please welcome Hannah.
Kia ora, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Right, well, tēnā koutou, tuatahi ngā mihi kia ranginui me papatua nuku me o rawa uri, ko te oranga me te mauri o rātou, ngā mea nui o te kōrero me te hui nei no reira tēnā rātou. Tuarua ngā mihi ki te mana whenua o Aotearoa, nā te mea ke Aotearoa au I nāia nei, ko te iwi Māori te mana whenua o Aotearoa no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rātou, ko hana tōku ingoa no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Hannah. I just started with a mihi or a greeting to firstly acknowledge the reason why we're all gathered here today, which is the well-being of our one planet and our one home. Also, I am beaming from New Zealand, so acknowledging Māori as the Indigenous people of Aotearoa. And I now also want to acknowledge Sharon and Morgan and Ricky for facilitating this panel today, Plastic Oceans Australasia and Griffith University, thank you. And to acknowledge my co-panelists, Peter and Simon, it's a pleasure to be here. So I care deeply about packaging and product stewardship, and my interest in this has come about through two avenues. Firstly, as Ricky mentioned, my partner and I have lived without a rubbish bin, and my partner Liam and I have lived without a rubbish bin for 5.5 years now, and in July 2017 we started the Rubbish Trip, which saw us travelling throughout the whole of New Zealand full-time for almost 3 years, delivering talks and presentations about zero waste living across New Zealand. So my interest is very deeply to do with grassroots community action and individual behaviour change, but equally I also have a legal, policy and research background. And so I'm also very interested in how government regulation and legislation can be used to reframe our economic settings to be less wasteful in the first place. So I'm also the coordinator of the New Zealand Product Stewardship Council, which is an NGO calling for mandatory product stewardship in New Zealand, and the co-founder and policy spokesperson of Takeaway Throwaways, which is calling on the government to ban single-use disposal and replace it with reusable alternatives at scale using government regulatory levers to do so. So what is product stewardship? I'm sorry, this is just going to be a slightly dry part of the presentation. And I put the slide together, I was like, oh man, it looks dry. So I brought SpongeBob along because he looks really excited, so that's going to get me through. So product stewardship is basically making sure that all people in the life cycle of a product are involved in, who are involved in the life cycle of products. So that's like consumers, retailers, manufacturers, recyclers, so on, that they all share responsibility for ensuring that product, in this case packaging, is reduced, reused, recycled, recovered, and for making sure that that product's negative impact on the environment, human health and safety is minimized. So while product stewardship recognizes this shared responsibility, it does also acknowledge that the producer has the greatest ability to minimize the adverse impact of a product because they're the ones that are designing and making the products, and therefore a product stewardship scheme should accord them the greatest responsibility. So what is the landscape for packaging and product stewardship in New Zealand? Well, until about 5 minutes ago, it was basically tumbleweed town. This is despite the fact that since 2008, there has been legislation in New Zealand that would have allowed successive governments to implement mandatory product stewardship schemes for packaging, despite the fact that there is a high level of desire from the public to see packaging regulated. Instead, for a long time, what we had was voluntary agreements between government and industry that never went anywhere, a slew of voluntary initiatives, and a lot of focus on things like anti-littering campaigns. Now, this has all changed quite dramatically in the past few months. Our current Minister for the Environment with the Waste Portfolio, Eugenie Sage, has really taken it upon herself to change the way that we approach packaging and waste and product stewardship in New Zealand by taking decisive action in the last few months under the banner of what I like to call Sage Against the Machine. So we have seen single-use plastic bags being banned. We've seen the Minister announce at the end of last year a beverage container return scheme for New Zealand, and I know that you guys have that in Australia already. We're super behind the times here, but this is being designed and should be ready by the end of this year. The Minister in July declared plastic packaging a priority product, which means that product stewardship schemes for plastic packaging now must be created within the next few years. And there's a consultation out at the moment to ban a wide range of hard to recycle and single-use plastics in New Zealand, a bit like what has gone through in South Australia. So it's safe to say that the tide is really turning in New Zealand. And in fact, we are seeing this around the world generally and also in Australia, to recognise that packaging is the way we're doing packaging is simply not sustainable, and also that there is a role for government intervention and regulation because the industry is not able to fix this on their own. So things are changing. So what now? Should we just sort of sit back with popcorn and kind of watch how it transpires? I would say probably not. We've reached a fork in the road now where we're seeing product stewardship schemes popping up around the world or being proposed. And I think the thing that we really need to be aware of is that there's a really big difference between an ambitious product stewardship scheme for packaging that gets us where we need to be and an average product stewardship scheme that probably won't. So there are three key things that I want to communicate with you today that are needed for ambitious product stewardship for packaging. First, they need to be designed to follow the waste hierarchy. They need to capture packaging of all material types, not just plastic, and they need to be mandatory, backed up by government regulation, and not left up to industry to design and control on their own. So let's go through these. So the waste hierarchy is the cornerstone of zero waste theory and the circular economy. Essentially, good waste policy focuses on preventing and reducing waste and reusing resources before we get into thinking about things like recycling and disposal. So when we're evaluating a product stewardship scheme for packaging, one of the first questions we want to ask is, how is this scheme going to reduce the amount of single-use packaging in our economy and then our reliance on raw materials like virgin plastic? So if we carry on the way we're going, the world is projected to see global plastic production double in the next 20 years. And we know that almost half of global plastic production goes towards packaging. So if a product stewardship scheme for packaging needs to be able to halt and reverse these trends if we want to be doing things about plastic pollution and the climate crisis. And to be clear, reducing the use of plastic usage is not just about lightweighting plastic packaging, it's about reducing the number of individual units of plastic, because this is necessary to reduce plastic pollution, and that's where reuse comes in. Let me be clear. We need to shift from a single-use packaging system towards a reusable packaging system. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimates that at least 20% of the world's single-use packaging can be replaced with reuse schemes, and further research is coming out to show that there's a relationship between the increasing market share of reusable packaging and a decrease in plastic pollution. These things are connected. And recycling. Yes, recycling is on the waste hierarchy, but it's near the bottom. It's not where we start. It's what we do when we've exhausted the options for reducing and reusing. Why? Firstly, because recycling doesn't necessarily help us to turn off the plastic tap. Secondly, because it's more energy and resource intensive and also more expensive than just reducing and reusing. And finally, because it's inefficient, particularly for packaging and particularly for plastic. It's not that common that recycled packaging gets turned back into new packaging. So it doesn't necessarily help us to close that loop, which we need to be doing for packaging. So any product stewardship scheme, if you're seeing that the solutions are predominantly based around recycling, that should start to raise alarm bells for you that it's not going to be ambitious enough to meet the needs of our 21st century packaging problems. The next thing is that product stewardship needs to apply to all packaging types, not just plastic. What we don't want to see is a shift from single-use plastic to just a single-use paper, more single-use card, more single-use glass, compostable plastics. We need to recognize that all these material types have an impact. And what we really need to be doing is shifting from single-use packaging systems to reusable packaging systems. And just to make clear, a packaging system that's based on recycling is still a single-use packaging system. So the reason that we want to make sure that product stewardship focuses on all packaging types is because if it's just focused on plastic and we really hit those reuse targets, what's likely to happen is that our reusable packaging is going to be predominantly in plastic. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm thinking about reusable packaging systems, say for beverage containers, I'm imagining lots of different material types, including reusable glass bottles, not reusable plastic bottles, right? So we want our product stewardship schemes to include all material types so that we can deal with the issues that different material types present, and also so that we can keep our options open for the reusable packaging systems of the future. And finally, product stewardship scheme for packaging needs to be mandatory, and it must be backed up by government regulation. Furthermore, governments really need to resist the temptation of simply handing over to industry, the packaging industry, to design and control these schemes. Product stewardship creates responsibilities for all stakeholders, so all stakeholders must be at the design table. Furthermore, if we want ambitious schemes, we have to be realistic about the fact that the packaging industry doesn't really have an interest in reducing the total amount of packaging out there. So we need wider perspectives. We also need to recognize that part of the reason that we do not have progressive legislation around packaging and product stewardship is because the industry has lobbied against this for decades. So it would be quite naive of us if we were to presume the industry has had a road to Damascus moment. So I don't have time to talk about this because I have to wrap up now, but I just want to say that if you're interested in this particular part of the presentation, I cannot recommend highly enough reading the Talking Trash report that came out a couple of weeks ago, released by the Changing Markets Foundation. It's really excellent, and although it doesn't include New Zealand and Australian case studies, the stories apply here too. So I want to wrap up now and thank you for listening to me. I just want to close by saying that the growing interest in packaging and the recognition that government intervention and regulation is going to be needed through tools like product stewardship is a really big like this don't come around very often, and schemes that are going to prevent and reduce single-use packaging, move us towards durable reuse schemes that are based on multiple material types, that are mandatory and are designed by a wide range of stakeholders overseen by government. Kia ora.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That was really informative and very, very on point and very fast, and dovetailed in really well with what Peter was talking about. So that was really very timely, and I think it really brings in what's happening across the sea with across the Tasman and what we're doing here. So things are really on the move, and it's fantastic the work that you're doing, and obviously, you know, on many different levels. I just thought I'd maybe ask you a bit more, a question to explore that a little bit more with you about the product stewardship scheme. So how could that be designed for packaging to help move to reusable packaging? You did touch on that already with your presentation, but I wonder if you could just tease that out a little bit more for us.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing we have to recognize is at the moment our packaging systems are very geared towards single use, and so is our waste management infrastructure. You know, millions of dollars have been poured into recycling and collection systems and so on. So there isn't an even playing field between single use and reuse packaging systems. So policy needs to level that out. So one of the key things that can be done is deposit return systems, like what you have for beverage containers, because for a reusable packaging system, you need to be able to get the packaging back to wash and reuse it. And so if you don't have a deposit return scheme on for all packaging types, it creates that disadvantage of convenience for reusables. So deposit return systems are a great starting point, but even within beverage container systems where we see that is the norm to have deposit return, you don't necessarily see a shift towards refillables. So there needs to be additional policy in place. For example, there need to be mandatory reuse targets, as well as mandatory reduction targets for single-use packaging. If necessary, there may need to be a single-use, what we call eco-levies, or a higher deposit on single-use, or a lower redemption rate on single-use when you bring that packaging back. And there may also need to be a diversion of funds towards reuse infrastructure and logistics. So for example, setting up washing and sterilization systems and getting our collection infrastructure to take to those rather than shredding machines or crushing machines that melt things down and reprocess them. So if we think about it from the perspective of the potential that product stewardship creates to allow a rebalancing of the economy towards reuse and away from single use.
Yeah, no, fantastic. No, it's really good to hear. Now we're getting quite a lot of questions in. So what I might do is I won't ask you another question now. I think we'll keep moving through with all our speakers, and then we can let some of our chat questions be asked, which I think will be really useful and worthwhile for our audience. So thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate your input, and as I said, it's really terrific to see what you're doing in New Zealand. Now, last but not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce Simon Roy. Simon is the Vice President and Managing Director of Amcor Australia and New Zealand. Leading the business since early 2018, Simon has held senior management positions in a variety of industries and countries, including the USA, Australia, Asia, and Europe, which pretty well covers it all off. Something people don't know about Simon, though, is he is quite obsessed with geography and maps. And clearly, he's been checking out a lot of what's going on with maps through all his travels. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Simon.
Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm lucky to go last because I got to hear Hannah and Peter's perspective, which is really great. I'm equally passionate about this topic. I'm someone who spends a lot of time hiking and in the water. And one of the things about working at Amcor is we're the largest manufacturer of primary packaging in the world. Quite frankly, we see the problem of plastic packaging very starkly. And we're very aware that it's incumbent upon us to take responsibility, to take leadership. To give you some idea, for those of you living in Australia and New Zealand, when you walk down the aisle of any supermarket, more than half of what you see in the supermarket, we make the packaging for those products. So it's very significant. And we and the people at our company see it as more than a responsibility. It's an opportunity for us to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I'm going to take you through a few things today about why do we have plastic packaging and how do we go about solving the problem that we have. If you just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just quickly, I mean, who is Amcor? As I mentioned, we're the global leader in primary consumer packaging. Primary consumer packaging is packaging that touches the product. So that's mainly used in food products, in healthcare products. I've got some samples here, which I hope you can see. So this is the kind of thing that you would see when you're taking your pills, or for your coffee, or for your chocolate, or if you need to wash things, or if you go to the hospital. So all of these things that you see are packaged in one form of packaging or another. If you could move on, please. Thank you. One of the things that's become very apparent for us, and Peter and Hannah both mentioned it, is that we're at a particular moment in time where we have tremendous support across the political spectrum for doing something about this problem. And we all have to work together, because it cannot be solved by either people in government or people in industry or consumers. We have to be working together, and I'll go through a bit why that is, but it's very much a time for action. Please, next. So when we look at packaging, there's all kinds of different ways that you can package products. And when we look at plastic packaging, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why is it that we have plastic packaging. Plastic packaging is extremely efficient. It has very low relative carbon footprint. It's very low cost to produce. It doesn't require much water to produce. So this is just a very simple graph, just showing if you compare flexible plastic packaging versus composites or aluminium or glass, you can really see here across all different aspects that the actual environmental impact mainly from a carbon and a water impact is much, much lower. And that's reflected in the cost of the product. And one of the problems that we have is, well, that's all great and everything, but what happens at the end? So if you go to the next slide, please. And this is what I refer to as the paradox of flexible packaging or flexible plastic packaging. On the one hand, you have this incredible efficiency. It's very, very light. It's got high barriers. It's really good for keeping food safe and fresh. Doesn't cost much. It's got a low carbon footprint. But the very core benefits of the product create an end-of-life challenge. So what does that mean? It means because it's so efficient, there's very, very little left at the end. So, you know, when you finish using the product, you've got this little tiny piece of plastic left that has very low value, and it's hard to get the economics right to collect it. So if you were to use a packaging product like glass, which is actually really inefficient, and that's why you have so much glass, and you have to use a lot of carbon and a lot of energy to make the product. But at the end of life, there's a lot of the product left. So the fact that it is inefficient means you have a lot left. So it's easy to generate a stream to recycle that product when it's finished. The other thing with flexible packaging is it's not really suited to mechanical recycling. And so over the years, what's happened is because the plastic packaging is so efficient relative to other forms of packaging, more and more people have used it, and it's used in more and more products, and everything from, you know, medicines to coffee to whatever. And no one's taken the time. Everyone's got really excited about, oh, this is great, it's cheap, etc., to deal with the fact that it creates an end-of-life problem. And both Hannah and Peter talked about that, and I would reiterate that. And the problem is, I think, bigger than most people recognize. It's a very big problem, and we really have to deal with it quickly. Because the amount of plastics that's going into our environment is accelerating all of the time. And our whole economy, our whole supply chain systems, all of these things are set up. And as Hannah said, we're geared up for single use. We're not geared up for reuse, recycling, reusable. That's not the way the system is built. If we go on to the next one, please. So I have all these kinds of numbers, and I'm sorry if it gets a bit boring, but I think it's important because I think it shows the seriousness of the problem. A lot of the time we talk about recycle rates. So what people are talking about with recycle rates is how much is collected. Now, unfortunately, how much is collected is not really reflected in how much gets reused. The reality is that the reuse is even lower than you would think. So you can see here on the graph that I've got here, for example, with plastics, literally only 2% of all plastics today are reused, which means the rest of it goes into landfill or goes into other areas. But even if you were looking at paper or metals and glass, the numbers are much, much lower than you would expect. You would expect that we'd be recycling a lot more. And I have a kind of the similar chart to what Hannah said. It's a little bit of a different picture, but basically the same, which is the architecture you need to avoid, we need to minimize, we need to reuse, and then we need to recycle. As I mentioned, mechanical recycling is really not that good for these kinds of plastics. The good news is that there have been tremendous advances in chemical recycling, and chemical recycling is incredibly efficient and can also deal with the fact that you've got plastics that have food waste or medical waste or whatever left. So you can break it all the way down to the molecular level and you can use it again. And it's actually very efficient, and that technology is coming on stream right now. So this is very, very good news relative to where we stand today. If we can continue, please. Thank you. So all in all, when we look at packaging, the very first word that we need to think of is responsible. We're the custodians for all of the environment that we have around us, and we need to be very, very careful and mindful of what we do. So we look at it from this way, that firstly, you've got to have very high quality packaging. It's critical and it's essential. It preserves food and healthcare products. It protects consumers. It minimizes food waste, and food waste is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, but food waste is a dramatic carbon impact, and we need to do things in terms of how we package food and products to reduce the amount of waste. Now, packaging's always been really important in terms of consumers from, being cost effective or being safe. But the thing that's changed is we have this awareness at government level and also at consumer level that the product needs to be sustainable. And thirdly, we need to be responsible in having packaging designs waste management infrastructure, and consumer participation so we can drive this agenda. Next, please. So the question that I always come at, and this is sort of like the tagline for everything that I'm talking about, is that the solution here has multiple dimensions. It's not the packaging itself. It's not just the waste collection infrastructure. It's not the consumer behavior. It's not the recycling infrastructure. Please, if you've pushed a button. We have to be dealing with all of these things simultaneously. Very, very simply, we have to design packaging that is either reusable or very easy to recycle. The second thing is we have to have the infrastructure in place so that we can collect it efficiently. And that goes back to what Hannah was saying, is that we haven't set these things up and we need to set these things up. It's not rocket science, but it needs to be done. We have to educate consumers so that they know what needs to be done. PET bottles are a great example where, in fact, there's lots of good recycling streams already available, but we don't utilize it. And we have to have the recycling infrastructure available. Next and last slide, please. So we at Amcor have pledged that by 2025, we will make all of our packaging recyclable or reusable. We're dedicating millions of dollars of resources to this as we speak, and it's highest thing on our agenda. So probably the main thing I want to get across is, you know, we view ourselves as a leader in the packaging industry, and we want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. We recognize that it's a problem, and we really want to be involved, and we're getting very involved. We have now been very involved with government, with NGOs, because the problem, and again I reiterate, it's worse than people think, and we have to deal with it, and we have to deal with it together. Thank you, Ricky. I can end there. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yep. Great, good. That was fantastic. And we've had a flurry of questions that have come through to ask you quite a few questions on your presentation and about how, you know, how is plastic a low carbon footprint, and a whole lot of technical questions. Just to let you all know that any of the questions that we obviously don't get through today, and some of them are technical questions where I'm sure Simon will be happy to send you through the references and where he's got that data from. You can follow up, and we'll make sure that these questions get answered for you. I think I just want to ask an overall question to what you've said with your presentation. You talk about the fact that the problem of plastic waste is solvable. What really has to be done to make that real? You know, from the big picture. And I know we've heard from Peter, and I know we've heard from Hannah, but I'd like to also hear that from, you know, what's your perspective on that? Because we know it's not just one bullet fits all.
Yeah, and I think you know, I actually really like Peter's approach because it's very pragmatic. We have to deal with the world that we live in, and I think a few things have to happen. Firstly, we need to recognize that the problem is very real. The second thing that we have to recognize is that none of us can do it by ourselves. And so what we need to do is, firstly, we need to harmonize packaging types. If you've got lots and lots of different technologies, it's very, very hard to reuse or recycle. If you can get down to very efficient single types, it makes it much easier to reuse or recycle. The second thing is we have to spend the time and the effort to put the proper collection systems in place. If we don't have the collection systems, you can do everything you want to make great packaging that's reusable or recyclable, but if you can't collect it, then it doesn't work. The third thing is that you have to make sure that you're using the correct technologies. So you have those technologies available when you're recycling, or whether you're using compostables or whatever, it has to be readily available. I think the fourth thing is you have to have regulations in place. We are very supportive of having appropriate regulations. It's clear that voluntary regulations have not been effective. It's too complicated, and there's too many options for free riders. And finally, you have to have consumer education. We need consumers to understand what's at stake and what needs to be done and how things work. And we're fortunate in Western societies to have a lot of the mechanisms available to do that education. In developing countries, it can be more difficult, and it can be more difficult to set up systems. But I think we need to support countries that are unable to support themselves. We need to use the power of and the money of Western governments to support so that can all be done. Because if we have poor countries and they're unable to deal with this, and they're going to be using plastics, single-use plastics that end up in the ocean, the problem's not solved. So it's very important that we do all of those things. It sounds complicated, but it's actually really not.
No, there's no, as we know, there's no one answer. I'm glad you mentioned about education, because obviously that's what we do a lot that we do through Plastic Oceans Australasia in Western countries and developing countries. So I'm glad you included that. What I'll do is I'll hand over to Sharon, who's been monitoring the questions, and we've got time for a couple of questions at least. So Sharon, over to you. Anything that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, so this is a question for all speakers. It comes in from a couple of questions that I'm combining. Hannah, you talked about refuse and reduce, and a question's come through that I think it's valuable for everyone to answer here, is how is the government policy supporting refusal and reduction campaigns?
Who would like to go first?
I think Peter better do that one.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I don't think they are, to be honest. I don't think that's the focus of the government, which is disappointing. You know, when you look at organic approaches to this, like Plastic Free July, for example, that's been quite successful here in Australia, and I'm interested in Hannah's view on that in New Zealand. I know it has gone international, but I think most of these initiatives have come from consumers and from concerned citizen groups and communities. I think it's a difficult issue for government to deal with in legislation, and the approach we took was the European Parliament approach. It may sound like a blunt instrument, but we just ban 10 most common items of plastic packaging or items we find in the ocean. Unfortunately, cigarette butts are excluded from that. I'd very much like to have seen them banned, because anyone who knows marine plastics knows they're our biggest scourge. But there are a number of other items that we can just say we just need to ban them. Now, that of course will cover refusal, which is because they're just not available. They're not sold, able to be sold. Therefore, there's no benefit in the producer producing them, I suppose. So we've gone down that that approach. There may be other items added over time, but you know, all I can say is, and this is my own analogy here, but it might sound like a weird one, but to get good policy through Parliament, it's a bit like baking a cake. You know, you get all the good ingredients together, that makes it edible, everybody mixes them in the right way, but the politics of the situation is how you set the oven temperature. And if you don't have the temperature set at the right level, then the cake's not going to come out cooked, and it's going to fail. And right now we have a political environment where people want change, and politicians are at least recognising that. And you know, I think it's an opportunity that we need to seize on.
Thanks, Peter. Hannah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, you know, bans are an obvious starting point for reducing, but they are quite a blunt tool and should be combined with things like levies on other single-use items if we're just targeting plastics, in order to make sure that we're not just doing false solutions, regrettable substitution. Reuse schemes are also a process of refusing and reducing, because for each time you reuse a product, you know, for example, a reusable glass bottle can theoretically be used between 25 to 50 times. So you've got one bottle instead of 50 single-use ones. So the reuse model is deeply connected to the refuse and reduce models. Yeah. I've also noticed someone was making a comment about how reuse schemes have a higher carbon footprint. So I'd like to talk to that at some point, but it doesn't have to be right now.
Thanks, Hannah. And Simon, you talked about re-gearing the system so that we get away from single use across to reusable. Can you talk about some initiatives that you've seen there that stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that there's a lack of initiatives at the moment. We've tried a number of things we're piloting in the United States and in Europe. Europe's particularly advanced from a regulatory point of view with regard to collection technologies. And the real focus that we're really working on now that we're very excited about is chemical recycling. And chemical recycling has historically not been readily available, but there have been significant breakthroughs in that technology in the last few years. And we're piloting a chemical recycling process in Europe right now. And we're hoping that in conjunction with one of our big suppliers in Australia, we're pushing hard to get the right incentives in place for us to be able to have chemical recycling in Australia. And I'm actually really positive that we're going to be able to get that pretty soon. It's just an interesting point, by the way. I know you said before there were questions coming up with regard to carbon footprint. Do you want me to speak to that? Because it's something that I think is a little complicated.
Yeah, I'd love you to.
Okay. The real reason that the carbon footprint's lower on flexible plastic packaging is just simply because the product's so efficient. So you just don't need to use much. So the amount of material that you need to use is so low relative to other forms of packaging. It doesn't really matter what it is. I mean, Hannah was referring to glass. Glass requires massive carbon footprint to make glass. It's very inefficient. And so sometimes, it's not to say that glass is a bad form of packaging or it's not reusable. It's just sometimes it's counterintuitive as to what's the best form of packaging. And this is part of the complexity that we need to work through, because oftentimes if we had flexible packaging that was able to be recycled and the systems were in place, oftentimes it's by far the most environmentally beneficial way to package something. The real problem is that we have this end of life problem. That's the problem. If we were able to deal with the end of life, it would be much more efficient because the carbon footprint impact of flexible packaging is so much lower.
And Hannah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the waste hierarchy. So often when we talk about zero waste, because we have the word waste in there, people think it's just about waste and end of life. So the circular economy theory is maybe a better way to talk about it. But each tier of the waste hierarchy is about energy and resource efficiency. So each tier of the waste hierarchy you go up, the greater potential for greenhouse gas abatement and reductions. So reuse is above recycling for a reason, because it's more energy and resource efficient. So when we're talking about the carbon footprint of different materials, there's two things to note. Firstly, they're often based on life cycle assessments that are actually quite vulnerable to all kinds of assumptions that you put in, that's what you'll get out. So the Break Free from Plastic movement actually released a report today on the problems with life cycle analysis. So I definitely recommend that people check that out. The second thing is that life cycle analyses very rarely compare between material types between the layers of the waste hierarchy. The reality is that reusing something uses far less energy and resources by an order of magnitude. So reusing a glass bottle will save you energy and resources. I think you only have to use, I mean, it depends on a bunch of variables, but provided you use it at least 3 or 4 times, you're going to start breaking even with a single-use plastic bottle. So we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we're comparing these things. The other thing to note is that you can do a reuse scheme inefficiently in terms of an environmental perspective, or efficiently. So some of the things to think about are, you want to have decentralized washing plants so the bottles aren't traveling as far, and ideally standardized bottles that everybody can use, for example, because that reduces costs. So there are ways of doing these things well, and there's ways of doing things badly. And to come back to chemical recycling as well, I think, you know, again, when we're talking about how it's an end of life issue that we have to deal with, we're forgetting the fact that you need to extract raw materials to make a single-use product. And so if we're relying on fixing the end of life, we're not solving that issue. Chemical recycling may well have a place in the future, but we need to recognize that it's still at the bottom of the waste hierarchy. And also the way that chemical recycling is being described is conflating two things: plastic to fuel and repolymerization, so turning that plastic back into plastic. At the moment, lots of chemical recycling that's happening is actually just to be incinerated as fuel. So the chemical recycling that's repolymerization in reality is probably at least a decade away. We don't actually have 10 years to sort this out. Like, honestly, we don't have that sort of time.
Just on that, if I could, that the chemical recycling to repolymerize is becoming available now. It's not 10 years away. That technology is now becoming available, just to be clear. And Hannah, I think that what you're saying about reusing glass, for example, the thing is, it's not simple. Sometimes the answer is correct and sometimes it's not. And we need to deal with the fact that there is complexity here and there are better solutions for A, B, and C. And we need to not think about it just bluntly, it's always A, because it isn't.
Yeah, no, and I don't think I'm advocating for thinking about things bluntly.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah.
I'm just keeping my eye on the clock because that's one of my jobs. This has clearly generated a lot of conversation. There are so many questions in the chat channel, and for some of you, I'm sorry I'm not going to get there. Peter, I'll hand to you in a moment. So I'm very sorry that we won't get through all of the long questions. It's been fabulous to see just how much conversation this has generated. Everyone agrees there's no time to waste. Having speakers come together today has been fabulous. As one of the co-hosts, I'll endeavour to see if I can get resources, because there's a lot of very clear questions just asking for reports or podcasts or examples. And if anyone actually wants to answer a few of those and pop a few things into the chat channel while we close out, please do so. But we'll endeavour to follow up with you through the team as we go forward. So Peter, did you want to put a last comment in? That's it from me. I will hand back to Ricky and Peter from here.
Look, yeah, thank you. And once again, thanks for everyone who helped set this up today. It's been very beneficial for me. I really enjoyed it. Hope everyone else has. Simon, I just wanted to address one thing you said in your presentation. You acknowledged the problem with voluntary schemes. If I could just say to you, because I know you're a man in an important position in the packaging industry, I'd urge you to pick up the phone and talk to the Prime Minister or the Environment Minister yourself and let them know your views, because they are clearly saying to us that the packaging industry opposes mandatory schemes, that they'll only accept voluntary schemes. So it was very encouraging for me to hear that you recognise the issue today. And I think it's what the public want. And I have collected through evidence that from numerous stakeholders that the industry feels that they can meet and they are quite ambitious, the targets that you've set for yourself at the moment, the voluntary targets, they are ambitious. The industry have said they should be able to meet them. They've also said that there's no different cost to them of a voluntary versus a mandatory scheme, and I still can't work out why we can't have one. So you agree
Our
with
view,
me?
Peter, our view is we should be pushing harder.
Right, okay. Well, if you could speak to the Prime Minister, it'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So we'll have to wrap up. I just want to bring everyone together, and obviously there's many things happening around plastic pollution and reducing its impact on the environment, and Plastic Oceans Australasia will continue to bring you the latest news online with that. I'd like to say a big thank you obviously to my co-host Sharon Rundle-Clear and the Griffiths team that have all worked hard behind the scenes with us to bring this session today. Obviously I'd like to thank all of our guest speakers and to thank all of you for joining us here today. If you've missed the previous webinars, be sure to go to either our POA or Griffiths websites. You can see them there and listen to the podcast. We will be sending you a link out today, which will follow this webinar. We will be attaching a quick survey on there, and we'd love you to give us your feedback on what you'd like to hear about next, so that we keep making sure that we deliver to you on the subjects, on the topics you want to hear about. So without holding anybody up, because we like to keep to time, I'd like to thank you all until next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.